All right, we are back, and we have a special guest with us today, former senior speechwriter for President Obama and a semifinalist for the Thurber Prize for American Humor. Since leaving the White House, he's written for the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Boston Globe. And from 2016 to 2018, he was the head writer and producer for Funny or Die, the outfit behind productions like the Emmy Award-winning Between Two Ferns with Zach Galifianakis, Billy on the Street, Drunk History, and many others. He's been featured in Vanity Fair, Men's Health, MSNBC, Outside TV, and now The Lineup. He is a New York Times bestselling author whose book, It's Only Drowning, A True Story of Learning to Surf and Search for Common Ground, is currently on the shelves. Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us today David Litt. David, thanks so much for coming on The Lineup.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Now, where are we talking to you from today? We're remote, so where are you at the moment?
I am in Asbury Park, New Jersey. Half mile from the beach.
Half mile from the beach and major scene set for the actual book. So, our audience, they listen to me waffle about surfing. They've been doing it for a few years. They're global, in terms of being core surfers and being introductory surfers. We try to be a window to kind of everybody. But tell us about the book, man. What's the pitch? Because I just finished it. I really enjoyed it. I think most surfers will as well. But give us the elevator pitch.
For sure. And I will say I've been doing a lot of talking about the book. This is a scary one because I think I might be the worst surfer you've ever talked to for this podcast. And in some ways, that's kind of what the book is about. But I'm excited to talk about, my experience. This book kind of started, although I didn't know it, 3 years ago when I began surfing, really as a way of getting over some depression that I fell into during the pandemic. And I was just looking for something new to do. I never thought I was going to surf. I was a skier growing up, but surfing seemed like, for crazy people. And so we moved to Asbury Park, New Jersey. We're, near the beach. One thing led to another. I started taking lessons. And more than that, I also started surfing with my brother-in-law. His name's Matt. He's a good surfer. And the two of us have nothing in common. Our surfing skill is one of those things that we don't have in common. But, he's covered in tattoos. I have not gotten a temporary tattoo, I think, for 15 years now. That's the last time I felt comfortable with it. He once threw out his back training to be an ultimate fighter, and I once threw out my back lifting a bag of cat litter. So Matt and I are two very different people. And I decided I wanted to try to make it to the North Shore and surf an overhead wave, right? Which I understand, on the North Shore, you got kids, literal kids doing that. But for me, that was pretty scary. And I knew I needed someone with me who could help me get there. And so I started surfing with Matt, and we formed this kind of unlikely friendship via surfing. And so the book is, it is a surf book for sure, but it also, I think, is the story of a friendship that crosses all these fault lines that, these days feel uncrossable in a lot of ways. So hopefully whether, people who haven't surfed will find it helpful. And obviously, I imagine right now I'm talking to almost exclusively surfers, and I hope you enjoy it too.
You encapsulated it perfectly, and I really enjoyed it. I've been surfing for 30 years. I think someone who just picked it up in the last few years is really going to enjoy it too. It's something we talk about in this podcast quite a bit. I'm very fortunate to kind of speak to folks like yourself, speak to journalists that I grew up reading. And one of the through lines with a lot of those journalists that I read sort of in the late 90s, early 2000s in the surfing world was, I was attracted to surfing because I was kind of running away from suburbia. I'm like, I'm going to go join this circus. This is really interesting. And for me, I had a fine upbringing, but it was pretty homogenous, and surfing was like a window to different cultures and different peoples and different ways of thinking. And it was really, really cool. And one thing we've noticed in the last probably 10 or 15 years is, and I'm sure this happens outside of surfing too, it's gotten really insular, and it's gotten really self-referential and really kind of tribal. And I think that tribal element's always existed, but that was something that was really refreshing reading your story, because it is the story about surfing. It's the story about someone learning how to surf, but it really broadens the perspective into other topics as well. And I'm curious if that was intentional or that was just kind of your lived experience in terms of writing it.
Well, I think I came to this from almost as far outside the surf world as you can come, right? Literally, I listen to the Beach Boys. I'm one of those people who's I understand surfing because I listen to the Beach Boys, right? That was me for 35 years of my life. And I thought that, like Inside Outside USA, that lyric in Surfin' Safari,
Hmm.
referred to foreign and domestic waves. Like I didn't
Right.
know that it was referring to to inside and outside. So that's how little I knew about surfing going into this. And I think for me, it was part of what made that so interesting, especially at a time where, like you're saying, insularity is so easy no matter what part of our lives we're talking about, right? We're all
Mm.
kind of living in these bubbles. And I think surfing was, for me, a way of getting out of that bubble and also into a world where you don't know as much about people, right? You're in the lineup and you don't know really anything about someone other than how they surf and whether they're respectful. And it was kind of refreshing in that way. So I felt like when I knew this was a book, well, number one, it was when I started embarrassing myself a lot. So almost right when I started, right? I was like, okay, there's a lot of funny stories here because I am humiliating myself on the daily. But the second thing is that I started to feel like, okay, I'm like learning about something that is very foreign to me. But at the same time, that experience of learning is something that I think a lot of us either have or wish we had, especially if we're learning something as an adult, right? It's like, I already know who I am. I know what scares me. I don't have to do what scares me if I don't want to necessarily, but I'm going to try to seek that out and maybe learn something from it and become a better person from it. And that's for sure what surfing did for me. And then on top of that, it also, made me like realize that there was this space for a friendship with my brother-in-law who we would never have been friends, I think, if we hadn't started surfing.
Yeah, no, and I think one of the things that I've found, and I know sort of other kind of authors in the surfing space have found too, is surfing. It's such a unique and kind of abstract experience that like trying to translate that into words is sometimes a real challenge. But I think your book, like it does a really good job of that in a lot of ways. And one of the things that I related to is just the relativity component, right? Where you're saying, I'm an adult learner. I'm learning here in New Jersey. My brother-in-law, Matt, he's been surfing for a long time. And, our goal is to go to Hawaii to surf the North Shore. And it reminds me, I bring up this quote all the time and kind of on probably the lineup surfing Mount Rushmore is a surfer from Ventura named Dane Reynolds. And he had this quote about kooks years ago. And he goes, and I've used it a ton of times on the show, but it's like, he goes, it has nothing to do with your surfing ability and everything to do with self-awareness. He goes, I know beginners who know they're beginners and they're absolutely not kooks because they're totally aware of that. And he goes, at the same time, I know surfers that are technically pretty good, but think they are so much better than they are. He goes,
Yeah.
that is a kook. And I think there's elements in this book that capture that really well, right? Because you may look at a group of surfers and go, oh my God, I will never be that kind of person. There might be like a very, very good surfer that looks at another
Yeah.
group and it's like, oh my God, there's always a bigger fish out there that you're like, oh, good
Yeah.
grief. Yeah.
Well, that's the one thing I learned very quickly is, at first I would get frustrated by how bad I was. I wasn't surprised, right? I was starting from scratch, but it was frustrating. And then I was like, this is great because I can learn from better surfers in the water. And certainly when I was starting out, I was like, that's literally every surfer in the water. So everyone just sitting and watching, you're like, you can learn something from somebody. And now, it's like, that's still, especially here on the East Coast in like fall and winter, that's still most people in the water. So it's still this sense of like, okay, I know enough to be respectful and not get in people's way. I'm certainly going for waves. And then at the same time, when I was writing this, it was also like a real, and I think you were kind of talking about this sense of like, do you deserve almost
Mm.
to get to write about surfing? And I think part of what I was saying implicitly was like, as long as I'm aware of my limits of understanding, right? There are things that I have not experienced on a surfboard that tons and tons of people will, and I can only watch. And then at the same time, I also felt like because surfing brought me and somebody so unlike me together, I was like, that's something that I feel really qualified to write about because that was an experience that I thought was really profound, and surfing was the reason for it, but it wasn't just a surf story. So I think combining all those things, is how I'd like to be as a writer, but I also felt like it was a little bit, to be totally honest, my way of being like, all right, I can be on a podcast like this one and not have to worry that anyone thinks that I'm presenting myself as like, oh no, it's cool, I learned to surf. Like,
I'm in the
I
same
got
boat. I
this.
don't have to
Yeah,
present
exactly.
myself. Exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, it is like, it is interesting too, because Matt, I think, is a very interesting character in the book as well, like longtime surfer. And as I said, like certain surfers, and I don't want to like, armchair psychologize Matt or anything, but they're tribal and they're insular and they do it for their own reasons. And a lot of times they're like, well, I don't actually want photos taken of me. I don't need my story
Right.
being told. I'm curious as to like how that conversation's gone with Matt, just writing about your guys' relationship and surfing together. Now the book is out and it's getting all this praise. Like, how's he responded to becoming more of kind of a public figure through the story?
Well, it's funny because he is a pretty private person, right? Like he played guitar at my wife and I when we got married. He like played he's a good guitarist, so he like played a song as we were like in the ceremony and stuff. But then he kind of didn't say anything for the next 3 hours, and people were like, "Oh, your wife's brother seems cool, but he's really quiet, right?" So I think it's reflected in his surfing too, where for him he just wants to be somewhere where it's not crowded, and that in and of it's not
Sure,
like
yeah.
he'll happily take worse waves and less crowds. Where I'm almost the opposite, where I'm kind of like, no, no, if everyone's at someplace, there must be a reason for it. And I think that was one of the many differences between us that kind of came out through surfing as well. But I also think for me, one of the most gratifying things about the book was when I showed him a copy for the first time and he kind of read through chapter by chapter, just the titles, right? He was like,
Right.
oh, that's when we were in Santa Cruz. Like, oh, yeah, that's when that, guy like yelled at me in Spain, right? And so I think I could see him in real time be like, oh, this is cool. This is our story. And it gets to be like a story that we're going to share. And that was neat. So I think he's been, I think he's been having fun with it. I don't know. I literally, once we're done talking, I've got to go put on the summer wax on my longboard, and then we're headed out. So I'll ask him.
You find out, yeah. One of the things that comes across in the book is, and you may even say it sort of verbatim, is like, I always thought surfing was for lunatics, like genuine lunatics, and something that comes over like on our side of the fence here at the WSL, and having been here for about 20 years, is when you're trying to kind of articulate, well, what is it about this that is so like profound to people. And the way I've described it in the past, it's like, well, if you think of the ocean, it's probably the most alien environment on Earth for
Yeah.
human beings. And surfing not only takes place in the most alien environment, but arguably at the most violent part of that environment,
Yeah.
right, where the land meets the sea. And especially when you get very elite level surfers, they're not only surviving in these conditions but thriving. And I think there's something really like visceral and primal that's attractive to that as an
Yeah.
idea. And I think your lunacy comment is kind of dead on. And I'm curious, now that you've become a surfer, you've written the book, do you consider yourself a part lunatic now that you've done it?
That's exactly what I was going to say. I was like, I started the book thinking surfing is for lunatics, and I still think surfing is for lunatics. I am just a proud part lunatic. And I think that what you're saying is so right, where I think it's a book called The World and the Curl. I think that's the one that talks about this. That's a history of surfing. And I don't remember the authors, but they talk about how surfing is this space between civilization and wilderness, right? Like
Mm,
the land is civilization, and then the open ocean is wilderness, and surfing happens right in that middle zone of like just a little bit of lawlessness. And it is like that's part of what makes it so intoxicating is existing in that very, very thin line between order and chaos. And the other thing that's so cool about it that I will say I didn't realize at all, and I do think it's probably like something you can appreciate more when you start later because you didn't grow up with the feeling, is just that wave energy
mm,
is totally unlike everything else we experience, right? So I started skiing when I was 6, and I love skiing, but it's like gravity, right? You
right.
understand roughly what it's like to be falling, and skiing is like falling, but there's snow and you have skis on. Whereas surfing, it is something, it's a different form of energy. And so it feels like this completely new space, for me at least. Where the craziest thing, and I did a book event where the guy who owns a surf shop here in Asbury Park he was asking me, who's the interviewer for the book event. And he was talking about this too. So it's interesting to obviously see like, someone who's surfed forever have the same view of like what happens to time
Mm,
when you're on a wave. And that is something I had to cut from the book because at a certain point, my editor was like, we want non-surfers to read this also. Like, you gotta,
right, right.
like, they're not going to get it. Like, just, like, let's keep some surfing stuff in, but let's not go into like, I had a lot of stuff about like board design and fin placement, and he was like, no, 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 but we got to cut that, which I think was a good decision. But I do think that one of the things I wish that I had been able to convey that I actually did have to take out of the book was that sense that like every second you spend on the face of a wave exists in its own little pocket dimension.
Hmm.
And so the moment you're off the wave, you're like, oh, I want to get back to that dimension. It's not just I want to catch another wave. And that's how I feel about it anyway. And I do think that feeling is so universal among surfers, whether you are like, you know, super hardcore and you've been surfing since you were old enough to walk, or you're like 50, 60, 70 and said, hey, I want to try this before it's too late. And, you know, your goals are limited, but also really high at the same time. So I think that's like that shared feeling is pretty cool.
For sure. And I think you described that so well as like its own pocket dimension, because I think something that I hear a lot and something I experience too, I'm curious if it's the same for you, is, because it happens in a quote unquote pocket dimension, that is part of what makes it so hard to articulate, right? It's like, and people come in from sessions, they're like, I remember paddling out, I remember getting smashed, I remember seeing a dolphin and thinking it was a shark, I remember sitting around a lot, and then I remember catching waves, but I don't actually remember, like I can't speak about what it was I was doing on them. So, yeah.
No, it's a secret, right? Like it's this crazy thing where it feels like something happened to you and you almost like the only way to know what it was that happened is to make it happen again. And so that's why it's so addictive, right? It's this sense of you're sitting back home and yes, you can remember a really good wave, but it's not the same
Mm.
as remembering like most other, again, I compare it to skiing, which again, I'm in love. I'm not here to like, talk down on the sport of skiing because I'm a big skier, but it is different, right? It
Mm.
feels like you were in a very different space while you're on a surfboard. And I think that's like, again, to me, that sense of connection. And it's also one of the fun things about this book since it's been out. It's only been out for a week, but when I talk to other surfers, and like no matter what else they just like Matt, right? They could be unlike me in any number of ways, including like big ones, small ones, whatever. But I think there's that sense of shared, like, oh, we've been there, right? We know
Mm.
at least in the broadest sense what that's like. And I also say that as somebody who's like still never been like I've never gotten barreled. I'm still working on it, and so I'm like there are things I know are out there like sensations and feelings and pocket dimensions that I'm still working toward.
That's a great point. I mean, I think Kelly Slater said it years ago. He goes, the reason I love it so much is because you can never master it. And so there's always the potential to learn something new, even if you have sort of a quote unquote bad session. But
well, if Kelly Slater is like, you can't master surfing, I'm like, okay, good. I feel a little bit less bad.
Totally. And we still have some years to catch up to his achievements.
That's right.
There's no
I'm
problem
sure
there.
that give me a couple of years, and people will be like, well, there's Kelly Slater and there's David. Yeah.
Exactly. And I say it exactly the same. The book is called It's Only Drowning, A True Story of Learning to Surf and the Search for Common Ground. It is out, it is available everywhere. Check it out. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk to David about a few more things. Don't go anywhere. All right, we're back. This is the Lineup Podcast. I'm Dave Prodan here with the author, David Litt. David, we've been talking about your book, It's Only Drowning, which is out everywhere at the moment. I want to roll back the clock a little bit because we talked a little bit about in that first segment and just the challenge of articulating what surfing is, to people that surf and people that don't surf. And I think you've done it so well in this book. But give us a bit of background about yourself. Born, raised, where did you go to school?
So I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, not too far from surfing actually, but I didn't know it. Like I didn't know anyone who surfed, and I went to school. I went to school in Connecticut, which is what people who went to Yale say, rather than being like I just went to school at Yale, which is a weird and pretentious thing to say. Um, so yeah, no, I went to Yale, and then I graduated college. I moved to Ohio to work on President Obama's first campaign, and then I moved to DC. DC, I will say, unlike New York City, really hard to get to good surf. It takes a long time, but so and then it was so I kind of grew up, and for people who are like sort of USA fluent, this will make sense. And if you're from somewhere else, I think you'll kind of get a picture, right? New York, New Jersey, right next to each other. But I feel like you grow up in New York and you kind of grow up racist against people from New Jersey, right? Like, oh, we're better than they are. And then, of course, inevitably, I fell in love with a Jersey girl, and we got married. And then we moved to New Jersey to the shore during the pandemic. And so suddenly, had gone from being like a city kid and like sometimes maybe mountains on vacation to being a half mile from the beach and seeing all these surfers. And so that for me was like a very eye-opening thing because in my mind surfing was like A, it was a California thing, or I was very West Coast, and B, it was also like not something that I knew anyone who did. It was something that like people did in movies or like, whatever. Like again, we were talking about the Beach Boys. It was like cultural. I knew about surfing from that, but I didn't actually like know surfers existed. So then you start to watch them and say like, okay, this is interesting, right? These people seem to be doing it and they seem like normal people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's a little bit like a Romeo and Juliet story. You got the Montagues, the Capulets, you and your wife, and
Yes, hopefully it ends a little bit better, but yeah.
well, so far so good, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. So far we're doing all right.
I'd say too that most surfers that listen to this podcast do understand like inherent tribalism. Like, I mean, we've got
Yes.
the big Australian audience, like Queensland, New
Sure.
South Wales, forget about it, the whole nine.
Yeah. Everybody's got that rivalry. Yeah.
Yeah, everyone's got it. You mentioned that surfing is something that you gravitated towards, kind of as a response to depression. I mean, COVID, the lockdown, the pandemic, I think that is something that's so relatable, whether it's a listener that picked up surfing during that time. I think everyone just had to figure out how to exist. Can you talk to us just a little more about that? And like, I mean, just the depression piece and then just, I guess, the steps leading you towards trying surfing. It was there, but there must be some sort of animating figures in there as well.
There were. I guess what I would say is I started surfing probably like a year after I got pretty depressed during the pandemic, or really it was like post pandemic when the variants started to come out. And then it was like it forced us all back inside. So it was this
Right.
sense of this wasn't just a one time thing. This is like reshaping big chunks of our lives. And at the time, I think a lot of it was just the news was depressing, and that got to me. I also think, and this is all in retrospect, but my Zoom therapist, who makes a few appearances in the book, at one point he said to me, "The pandemic just left us all alone with ourselves. Even if you were out working, we all had different experiences, but to some extent, you just had more time with yourself." And I think a lot of us, and I think I was one of those people, said, "There's something about me that I'm not totally comfortable with," and that became kind of the seed for depression. And I used to be sitting in my office and I would scroll the news and worry. And my wife would come up behind me and she'd say, politely, like, "Have you ever thought about picking up a hobby?" And I would be like, "No, I have a hobby. And my hobby is scrolling through the news and worrying." And it took a while, right? Like one of the things that sucks about depression, and if anyone's listening is going through this, like one thing I wish I had done sooner was talk to someone about how I was feeling and ask for some help. And I think I felt embarrassed and I wish I hadn't. So definitely if you're going through it, like reach out to people in your life. They are there for you. Um, well, part of what makes it so hard is it's hard to do anything, right? You want to be doing something to try to get out of this, but you don't have the energy somehow to do it. And so I think it just took some time, and then surfing was kind of the thing I latched onto. And I think one of the reasons I latched onto it was that Matt, my brother-in-law, who we've been talking about, he was doing really well at that time, right? Like his business was doing well, but more than that, he just seemed to be handling the uncertainty of life better than I was. And I was like, okay, I don't want to be exactly like him, right? I'm not buying a motorcycle, I'm not getting tattoos, but he does seem to know something about the world that I don't know. And so maybe there's something that he does, some way into his way of seeing the world. And for me, that was surfing. Now, all that only makes sense in retrospect, but I think it's a big part of it. And it's definitely what happened since, where like now, obviously we're still living in a crazy world, but I feel much more able to handle it and be part of it because of what surfing did for me, right? In a way, this is kind of a book about how I fell back in love with life.
It's a great point. I mean, I think that is a challenge for a lot of us and myself included, that have gone through depression, because you do have to reach out and seek help and speak to somebody else. The problem, right, is that you start often from a place of like, oh man, I don't even like myself. Like, I don't want to be stuck with myself. Like, how do I make that jump? So it's a really good point. I mean, I'm curious too, just in your case in particular, like so accomplished, like editor-in-chief at the Yale Record. You were a speechwriter for arguably one of the greatest orators in human history in Barack Obama. It felt like your life up until that point had like pretty tangible achievements and like a high achieving person. With surfing, I think we can all accept that like it is different for everybody. Everyone's version of it's different. But it is very hard to feel high achieving in it, regardless of your level of talent, because it is one of those things where it's like, end of the day, the ocean's in charge. So like the ceiling on swagger and surfing, even for the best surfers, is so much lower than almost any other activity.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, I also feel like the ceiling, in weird ways, is even lower for the best surfers in the world, right? Where
Yeah.
like, the people who are really good, there's like obviously in the culture, there's a sense that you don't like claim a wave, right?
Right. Sure.
And so for me, I was like surfing 1 or 2 foot waves when I started out on my foam board, and I was like claiming the hell out of those waves because I was like, no one's gonna mistake me for like somebody who's trying to look really cool. And I was like, this is hard. I try to like wait till I'm underwater to like pump my fist or whatever. But sometimes I'm like, never mind. I'm just enjoying this. And I think that part of that too is, you know, surfing. And I had to learn this, that it it's a really cool sport in that for most of us, the goal and like the ultimate goal is to keep doing it. Right.
Mm.
That's the reward for doing it, is to get to keep doing it. And that's totally not how I lived the rest of my life. And frankly, it's still not totally how I live my life. My wife is upstairs as we record this, and I can imagine her being like, okay, come on, don't overstate how many lessons you've learned here, buddy. But I do think that for me, it was this understanding that I gained from surfing of part of what made me feel so um, depressed and kind of drove me into that, I think, was that I became almost like too focused on, if I accomplish this thing or check off this box or do
Right.
this thing, then everything's going to be all right. Which is just not how the world works, right? Like I know that intellectually, but I had fallen into that trap. And then COVID, and the pandemic, when that hit, everybody, whatever your plans were during that time period, they all got derailed, right? We all went through that together. And so I do think it was that moment when, like, living that way, where it was like checking a box, then checking the next box, then checking the next box, it didn't work. And I had to find some other way to live, or at least some way to have a little bit of balance in my life. And so that's one of the things I'm so grateful that I learned from surfing. And I didn't know this going in. I think it was kind of random that I decided to sign up for lessons in something where yes, you can pick a goal. You can say, okay, I want to get to the North Shore. But ultimately, once you get there, like, it's cool that you do it, but that's not really what the point was. And it's certainly not
Right.
like the point going forward, right? It's like you do it because you like to do it.
It feels like surfing, and I think this kind of comes across in the book as well. Like, it's one of those activities where the phrase is "the more you learn, the less you know" is very, very appropriate. There's like a very old movie about Pete Maravich, the basketball player, called Pistol Pete, and I watched it when I was like a kid or something. But his dad in the movie is like a college basketball coach, and he's like coaching his team, and he pulls them off the court in practice, and he's like holds up a basketball, and he goes, "This ball represents everything I know about the sport of basketball." And then he holds up another one. He goes, "And this ball represents everything that's yet to be discovered about the sport of basketball." And then he takes a Sharpie and he dots it and he holds it up and he goes, "This dot is what you know." And every time I learn something new in surfing, I'm like, my brain's like, "This dot is what you know," kind of thing. Like, but
Totally. Yeah, and it's so hard to learn too, right? These are all the things I didn't realize when I started, of like just the basics of, it's really loud because there are waves everywhere, so you can't have someone tell you what to do all the
right,
time, right? You're kind of, even when you're around people, you're a little alone in it. Uh, right, little things like that. I will say I feel really lucky that as an adult learning to surf, that I started now and not 20 years ago or something. Like, between, you can get a foam board so you don't hurt yourself as much when you
sure,
start,
yeah,
and like, someone can video you from the beach and you can watch yourself. There, it's definitely more accessible, but it's also still, as far as most things go, pretty inaccessible. And so that's been something that I feel like, for the same reason, so much of this is because it was hard. I feel like I learned a lot, and I'm really grateful I went through it. And then also, the other thing that I love about surfing is you have those, like, so much grinding it out, but then the reward is these moments of transcendence that are almost indescribable. And that, I think, is both cool in and of itself, and it's also kind of a cool metaphor for the way so much of life works.
for sure. And I was going to ask you about that too, because you brought it up just before. It's definitely in the book where you acknowledge, like, observing Matt in those early years of COVID. You're like, it seems like he's weathering it well. And I'm curious, like, I think probably the experience you went through in learning how to surf shifted your own Overton window on like, what am I able to like weather here in a lot of ways? And I'm curious. I mean, we're a few years removed from the pandemic, hopefully, but at the same time, I'm curious, like in your professional life now, like, do you feel like a different person? Have any of the kind of the lessons from that experience of learning how to surf like translated almost directly over to your professional life?
Yeah, for sure. I would not describe myself as like a chill person then or now. I can aspire to be more chill, but I would say I'm like definitely among the more chill versions of me that was possible. Whereas during the pandemic, that was certainly not true. And I think that is, it's really valuable. And it's also valuable in the sense of sometimes when I am just dealing with something in life, right? It could be just you look around, you read the news, and you're like, oh no, whatever that may be. Or it's like any of the number of challenges life throws at us, right? Personal, professional, you name it. Sometimes I will say, okay, let me stop for a second and just ask myself, how would a surfer handle this, right? And I kind of mean that in a broad sense, but often it helps, right? It's a sense of saying, okay, I'm gonna, accept that this is just gonna suck for a little bit, right? Which I feel like is something I learned from a million paddle outs of just that this is going to be really unpleasant until it's not anymore, and there's nothing I can do about it. So I'm just going to accept that. Sometimes it's a matter of saying, all right, I'm going to commit fully to something, even though I don't have full knowledge of what the outcome's going to be. Right? I'm just going to go over the ledge on this and find out because that's the only way you're ever going to have that experience and get to know what it's like. So I do think, like, I'm sure that people listening can relate to this. For once you start surfing, you start to be like, oh, this reminds me of surfing about literally everything. And I think sometimes that I have found is like annoying to your friends and loved ones who don't surf, but it's also super helpful in life. And it does make me feel like, I'm not a different person, but I'm a different version of the same person thanks to surfing. And I'm really happy about that.
Makes a ton of sense. We're going to take one more quick break. And when we come back, we'll wrap up our conversation with David Litt. All right, we are back. This is The Lineup. I'm Dave Prodan with the recently relocated David Litt, author of It's Only Drowning, A True Story of Learning to Surf and a Search for Common Ground. David, it's been really, really nice talking to you today. Before you go, we did put out questions for our Instagram followers at The Lineup Pod. We got a bunch back for you. We've whittled them down to 3. Okay. First question is from @Lonnie_Pua, who asks, what specific surf challenges did you face outside of the water when you first started surfing?
For me, the hardest parts about learning to surf outside of the water were emotional, right? Like some of them they take place in both spaces, but the fear and the sort of lying awake at night the day before a surf session where I know that like, okay, this is going to be bigger than I've surfed or colder than I've surfed. That's going to be tough. Honestly, the first time I put on a 5'4" wetsuit to go surf in winter, and A, just getting that thing onto my body, and then B, having to like look at myself in the mirror afterward, that was not my favorite experience. And so I think those things were, that stuff was super challenging. And one thing I will say that wasn't as challenging as I thought, especially in New Jersey, it was pretty welcoming in terms of like locals, right? So New Jersey, I have found, is if you're respectful and you kind of know the basics of etiquette, it's a place where people, there's definitely better surfers in the lineup. They'll go get a wave that, you're waiting on the shoulder, and they'll get up to the peak, and that's the way that works, and it's cool. But it's not a place where people are like, oh, you don't belong here, as long as you're not, endangering other people. And I do think that's really fortunate. I didn't know as much about the sport, but I think the fact that I didn't wander into a place, and there was one instance in the book where I write about in Jersey where that was not the case, but it was noteworthy that it happened, as opposed to being kind of the rule. It was more the exception.
Second question is from @TreeHatJ, who asks, what has been your worst wipeout so far? Please provide details.
Yeah, one of the things I love about surfing that I did not know is that I feel like wipeout stories are actually better, and everyone agrees they're kind of more fun than stories about a wave you make. For me, Matt and I were surfing in Zurriola in San Sebastian, Spain, and it was double overhead, like 8 to 10 feet on surf line. I had never surfed anything close to that big, and I went out. I was like, okay, this is our tune-up trip before we go to the North Shore. I got to give it a shot. And I I remember this like big wave that was, it was just, one of those ones that breaks outside because it's bigger than all the other ones you've seen that day, came at us. I was not going to make this wave, but I was like, maybe I can get over it. And Matt and I are both paddling, and the last thing I hear, he just goes, "We're in trouble." And then I just got pitched off the lip, right? It was because I almost made it, and almost making a wave like that is the worst, where you're just in the worst possible spot. And so I remember, like, I'm sure a lot of people listening have experienced this, is like being thrown out of a second story window, right, where you're just sort of suspended in midair. And then the thing I did not realize was hitting the water, but going straight to the bottom and then hitting the bottom, and a hold down that just lasted so much longer. I feel like all of us have that mental hourglass if we're used to surfing waves of a certain size, where it's like in a certain place, okay, after this amount of time, I get to breathe again. And so it was once that hourglass ran out and then I couldn't get to the top. And, I was okay, but it was scary. And more than that, it was the kind of thing where I just I had trouble committing even to smaller waves for a couple weeks after that, because there's that visceral sense inside you of like, I don't want to be under that water ever again. So you got to fight through that, which was hard.
Every surfer knows that feeling. So great answer. Last question we got from the folks at the Lineup Pod is from @ChewCool for Megan, who asks, which is harder, writing jokes for President Obama or getting into a wetsuit on a cold morning?
Probably the wetsuit in certain ways, right? Like, it's definitely more intimidating writing jokes for the president, and I would say the stakes are higher. But that moment of like pure in the moment, this is awful, am I going to get through it? I would take sitting in the Oval Office watching President Obama read through jokes and being like, I think we could do better. Like, that's bad. That was a bad feeling. But that feeling of being like half naked in a parking lot in, New Jersey someplace when it's snowing and you're trying to slip on like a wet 5'4". If you asked me which of those spaces I would prefer to be in, I will take like the warm, dry Oval Office being kind of, given the side eye by the president any day.
I like it. Great questions. Thanks for everyone who wrote in for David Litt. Last round. It is the lightning round. So we have 10 questions for you to answer as quickly as you can. First question. If you can only have one board set up for the rest of your life, single fin, twin fin, thruster, quad, bonzer, or finless, which would you choose?
Quad, I think.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Burrito or pizza?
Pizza, because you're talking. I'm in Jersey right now.
I was about to pull your card on that one, man.
Yeah.
Last book you read?
The last book I read was, I'm in the middle of a book right now called The Spinach King, which is about a like farming dynasty in New Jersey and the rise and fall of the guy who ran it, as written by his grandson, and it's by a guy named John Seabrook. That sounds weird. Like, you're probably listening to this being like, okay, why would I read that? It's like a cool family saga. It's kind of like Gatsby meets Succession, but also there's, spinach involved. Highly recommend it. It's good.
I like it. So not the mortal enemy of like the Liver King. We're not putting them in the opposite corners of the octagon. I like it. Where am I? Best surf film ever?
Oh, man. I don't know if this I bet I'm going to get shit for this, but I am one of those people that's just like addicted to the 100-foot wave on Max. Sure. And I understand it's like its own style of thing, but I really, really like it. And I obviously have not surfed Nazare, but I did get to go there once, and they were running a contest because we just got lucky and the waves were big, and that was a cool experience just to see that.
Very cool. What is one wave you never have to go back to?
Oh man. Well, that one that we talked about earlier, where I got pitched off the lip of a double overhead wave in Spain. Like, I would love to go back there, though. It's funny you're saying that I'm violating the spirit of the lightning round with the length of this answer. But one of the nice things about starting late is that I'm still at a point where almost any wave, I'm like, one day, like, I don't know. I don't want to go back there tomorrow necessarily, but like one day I want to get back there.
I like it. If you only get to surf one wave for the rest of your life and you can dreamcast it, perfect conditions, just you and your friends, which wave would it be?
I'm La Fatenia in France, which was a break that Matt and I went to. I loved. I will also channel like my inner Matt here and just say New Jersey, right? Like there is something about your home break that it doesn't matter if it's like, not as world renowned. The Asbury Park Dog Beach is that's the beach.
Love it. Best person to share a lineup with?
Well, I mean, I kind of wrote a book about it, so I'm gonna say my brother-in-law on this one. And it is. I will also say if you're listening, in general, my kind of takeaway from my experience is like share a lineup with somebody who's totally different from you, in addition to all of your friends who are more like you, and you'll learn a lot. It'll be a cool experience.
Worst person to share a lineup with?
Oh man, there was a guy in Darlington, New Jersey, where he like, it was like the most classic like surf insult, because he was like, "Hey, have you just started surfing?" And I was kind of like, "Well, yeah, a year ago," but I thought he was being supportive, and then I realized he was insulting me. And then he was like, "No, you can't be here. Like, don't be so close to me." I was like, "Okay," it's like some dude with a neck beard, and I was like, I'm not like angry. It was mostly sad. I was like, I feel like if you're the guy with the neck beard picking on me, like something has gone wrong, and I hope it goes right. But so I hope after things turn around a little bit, we'll go. I'll be happy to see him again. But that was not my favorite.
Fair enough. Last question. Finish this sentence. I will next achieve a state of happiness by.
Well, I guess once we're done recording, we've got like decent longboard waves in Maniloki, New Jersey. So I'll next achieve a state of happiness sometime in an hour or so once I get down there.
Right on. David, it's been awesome talking to you. Congratulations on the book. Congratulations on all your success. Everyone check out It's Only Drowning, a true story of learning to surf and the search for common ground. It is out everywhere. And please come back anytime, David. And if you or Matt ever come to a CT event, WSL event, shoot us a note. We'd love to catch up in person and show you the sites.
That'd be awesome. I would love that. All right, cool.